So hello, everybody. I'm Marcela Rojas Salas. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a project coordinator here at Valor US. And I'm joined by several of my colleagues on the call today, and I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Hey folks, my name's Tiana. My pronouns are they, them. I'm coming to you from San Diego, which is the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay people. I'm the Director of Training and Community Education at the San Diego LGBT Community Center. And just a tiny bit about our center, we provide targeted programs and services to the full diversity of the San Diego LGBTQ community. So this includes, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, trans, non-binary, immigrant, and HIV communities. We do housing, therapy and counseling, HIV testing, PrEP access, name and gender marker change clinic. We do medical advocacy, food banks. I mean, you name it and we'll do it. And so I'm really excited to be with you today. So thank you for welcoming me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Director of Prevention at Valor US. And so happy to be joined by my wonderful colleagues today and you all. Looking forward to this conversation.
And we also have Shelby, who's going to go ahead and introduce herself too. Thanks, Shelby, for being our tech support.
No problem. Hello, everyone. My name is Shelby Phillips. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Project and Communications Coordinator here at Valor. And I'll be providing you all with tech support on today's session. So feel free to send me a private chat if something comes up today, and happy to be here.
Thanks, Shelby.
No problem.
Can we go to the Valor US slide? And there's Shelby. So just a little bit about Valor US. We lead a national movement to end sexual violence in partnership with survivors and other anti-oppression movements through a multifaceted approach of prevention, intervention, policy, education, research, and advocacy. And so we provide leadership and resources to a strong network of advocates, crisis professionals, volunteers, and community partners that make up California's safety net for survivors of sexual violence. And together we promote the best interests of survivors and advocates for systems and policies that end sexual violence. And before I get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and encourage folks to go ahead and utilize the text chat to ask us questions throughout the webinar. We'll also be using the poll questions, so those will hopefully pop up for you. If you have any issues with that, please feel free to reach out to Shelby. Folks that are dialing in from your phone numbers, if folks don't know already, you're going to go ahead and dial *6 if you're trying to mute or unmute yourself. And of course, slides and recordings will be available after our webinar. And if folks are hoping to get closed captioning, go ahead and click on the bottom right tab, closed caption, to make sure that that's coming up for you. And just a couple of web conference guidelines. Again, we encourage folks to use the text chat and to respond to our conversation today. The more that we engage with you and hear questions from you, we know what's resonating with you, what folks are thinking, and I think that's really helpful when we're not able to be here in person with each other. I encourage folks to be present with themselves and our presenters, and of course, take breaks as needed. I know that this content can often be triggering for folks, so feel free to take a step away, turn down the volume, get some water or tea, whatever it is that you need. I know I tend to have 3 different beverages at my side at all times when I'm doing a webinar. And also, I encourage folks to share what you learn with your community and to make sure that we're keeping any personal stories that we hear here with us, unless of course we get consent to share. And so I do want to hear from folks who's here with us today. A few of you have introduced yourselves. Anyone who's just joined, feel free to share your name, your pronouns, where are you located right now, what's the weather like in your area. I know we have some folks in California, we have some folks in Oregon. Awesome, welcome Rise. We've got a couple people from Rise on here. Yes, I'm so excited to hear more about the Gala Pride and the Diversity Center. I know that Janae will be talking about that later today, so we're excited to hear from her. I think we skipped a slide, Shelby. It's a poll question. Alrighty. So our first poll question, just to get a sense of who's joining us today, are folks coming from an LGBT center, a rape crisis center, perhaps a dual agency or a different agency. If folks are coming from a different agency, I'd be curious to hear where you're coming from, what sort of brought you to the webinar today. What are you hoping to learn? Awesome, welcome Linda. Welcome Norma. It's very hot up there, isn't it? I'm hearing it's a lot hotter in Northern California this week. Welcome Angel, welcome Sandy. Lots of folks joining us from LA today, Oakland, Madeira. Okay, so it looks like most folks are coming from either a rape crisis center or a dual agency. We've got a couple people coming from an LGBT center and another organization. So if you'd like to share that with us, feel free. Hello, Audrey. Awesome, good to have you here. Alrighty. So moving forward to discuss a bit about our objectives. Thanks, Shelby. So a bit about what we're hoping to gain today. We hope that by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to identify and understand how heterosexism and cissexism has an impact on sexual violence and rape culture. We hope that you'll be able to identify some key strategies needed to build meaningful collaborations between your rape crisis center and LGBT centers, wherever you're at in your journey, wherever you're at in the capacity of your learning and your collaboration. And lastly, we're hoping to demonstrate how collaborations between rape crisis centers and LGBT centers can start a culture shift in both of our fields. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start off by naming how heterosexism and cissexism shows up in our world and also how it perpetuates rape culture. So in order to really understand rape culture, we have to think about the ways that we are collectively thinking about sexual violence, including the systems and the institutions that we all reside in, right? And so I think most of us know that rape culture often shows up in situations when sexual violence is trivialized or normalized, made into a joke. And it's often upheld by a culture that defends and justifies sexual violence. You'll see my tweet here, or not my tweet, but the tweet that I put up here, that rape culture is often upheld not only by rapists, but by people who are devil's advocates, who have sincere questions or wait for the facts. But I think a critical component in the conversation about rape culture that often gets missed or marginalized is how power, oppression, and discrimination uplift rape culture. I think many of us understand that rape culture is rooted in the conditions that make sexual violence possible, like patriarchy, transmisogyny, white supremacy. The list goes on. I'm sure folks can drop some other ideas in the chat or systems in the chat that perpetuate both sexual violence and oppression. And so really critical to understanding rape culture is understanding that the LGBTQI community is not immune to a systemic culture of rape. In fact, it's incredibly important that we look at how violence that LGBTQI folks face is influenced by race, influenced by disability, influenced by ethnicity and class, and whether someone's incarcerated, whether someone is unhoused, and whether someone participates in sex work. So this is a moment where I kind of want to open up the conversation and hear from other folks on the call. What are some examples that you've seen in the media or examples that you've seen in your community or coming from your own clients and community members of how rape culture shows up specifically in the LGBTQI community? And so as folks are sharing in the chat and thinking of ideas to share, I want to share a few of the things that came up for me when I was thinking about this. And first things first, part of rape culture is really how we're taught that our identities and our privileges often entitle us to other people's bodies, right? And so an example of this might be cisgender folks, someone like myself who identifies with my gender that was assigned at birth. And so often something that happens is that cisgender folks sort of bluntly ask transgender folks or gender nonconforming folks or intersex folks about their genitalia. And yet it's so normalized that people don't recognize this as a form of sexual harassment. Another thing that really gets normalized as well is the fact that incarcerated people's bodily autonomies, people's bodily autonomy is often subjugated behind bars. Something that we see often is strip searches and pat downs that are really normalized as a daily part of their lives, and often enables and hides sexual harassment behind bars. And I think we know that oftentimes strip searches and pat downs are utilized against queer and trans folks as a form of sexual harassment, as a form of figuring out what their genitalia looks like. And again, a form of sexual harassment that often doesn't get recognized. Checking the chat to see if folks have shared anything. Still introducing ourselves. Yes, Pamela, yes, it shows up in TV and music glamorizing the act. Yeah, could you say more about that? Which act you're speaking of? And I also want to add that given that rape culture often conditions individuals and institutions to support abusers when they're accused or charged with rape, and often instead of supporting survivors, name victims as quote unquote career destroyers or life ruiners. So given this information, what does it mean for trans people behind bars speaking out about sexual harassment at the hands of a correctional officer or another authority figure? This is sort of an open-ended question that I'm presenting. How do we think that these institutions focus on how the harassment impacted the victim? And I can say from experience that oftentimes the code of silence behind bars gets uplifted and upheld by people that are in power, that have the power to change the culture and have the power to extend accountability and consequences, but often instead protect their colleagues. Power and control, absolutely. Katie will be talking about power and control later today. And so, like I said, if rape culture is about avoiding placing responsibility on a person who has caused harm and instead places blame on the victim, and in many cases creates this sort of false dichotomy between who is a good victim and who is a bad victim. Oftentimes we see people who are multiply marginalized placed in in a situation where they're deemed as a bad victim, deemed as someone who isn't acting in the way that society expects victims to. And so if this is something that's often upheld by rape culture, what does this mean for a trans sex worker experiencing street harassment who defends herself? What options are presented as a viable accountability and support system for her? And again, another open-ended question for folks to ponder as we're working through this webinar. Yes, Pamela, so with the music and lyrics and TV shows, the act of rape and then often get away with the crime. So people get the impression that is how it is in the real world. Yep, this is something that often happens where accountability is sort of swept under the rug. Another thing I do want to share as well is if rape culture is also about who we extend empathy and compassion to when sexual assault is disclosed, how does rape culture show up for a gay man or a person who is gender nonconforming who's seeking services, when in fact the dominant narrative often highlights violence against women? And so even if survivors fit within this dominant narrative, folks are still experiencing trivialization, right? And so for survivors who exist outside of this dominant narrative, the minimization often increases. I want to give a quick shout out to a TV show that folks might have heard of, I May Destroy You. We were going to show a video about this, but this is, if folks have seen it or folks have not seen it, I encourage folks to watch it and get into a little bit of a media analysis to get a sense of how queer men are being treated when they come out and expose sexual violence. Oftentimes what we see for many survivors is that they're being called liars or manipulators, or that they are overreacting to the situation, right? And so this often leads survivors to not be taken seriously when reporting rape to law enforcement and to university campuses, right? And so I present many of these questions because an integral part of ending rape culture is really understanding how heterosexism and cissexism serves to dehumanize LGBTQI folks, condones queer and trans antagonism, and increases the likelihood of sexual violence behind in the community and behind bars. So again, I invite folks to ponder and examine and ask questions throughout the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Tiana, who's going to set the foundations for us to understand cissexism and heterosexism.
Thank you, Marcela. Thanks for really setting up that landscape. So, I want to define and discuss cissexism and heterosexism with you, but to do that first, I really want to explore the gender binary to illuminate how this construction of gender creates bias and contributes to sexual violence. So the gender binary, right? This is a system of classifying gender into two dichotomous fixed categories, right? It's the idea that there are only two genders, men and women, and those things don't change. Now, this gendered framework for categorizing humans was introduced during the process of European colonization of the US. A binary system of gender was created and enforced as a means of protecting patriarchal norms and upholding European nationalism. Okay, major religions like Christianity acted as authorities for gender roles. Now, historically, gender dictated who could vote, what type of clothing you're allowed to wear in public, which gender you're allowed to marry, and what type of job you're allowed to have. So how does gender happen, right? So when we're born, we are assigned a sex at birth, right? Based on what our genitals look like. We're given a legal status as female or male, right? And based on this designation, you're then assigned a gender to go with it. So if you're assigned female at birth, you are then described and socialized as a girl and then a woman. And if you're assigned male at birth, you're then described as a boy and then a man. Now, in some cases, folks are born intersex, and this is when a person's external or internal genitals are some other natural variation that's not distinctly a penis or a vagina. Now, historically, these folks are operated on despite it not being medically necessary. This is a form of genital mutilation, which reinforces the sex and gender binary. This practice is a direct result from our society's bias towards this binary framing of categorizing human bodies. Now, our ideas about gender are influenced by the media, religion, mainstream education, political, cultural systems, right? Even our families. They're the first people to show us and teach us about how to groom our bodies, right? They choose our type of clothing, which toys we play with, who we can have sleepovers with, and how to act and express ourselves relationally and emotionally, right? So our personalities and how we treat others is greatly impacted by gender and the biases that stem from this binary system. So let's think about gender roles. Now, gender roles define a person's interests, their hobbies, expertise, right? And so we are traditionally taught that, oh, men are naturally good at math, science, and logical decision making. And women are great at cooking and nurturing others through parenthood and partnership. Men are aggressive and dominating. Women are coy and subordinate, right? Now, this system of gender also defines what each gender should look like. Men should be taller and stronger than women, have shorter hair. Body hair is masculinized and only acceptable for men, right? We even gender clothing. So men should only wear pants and shorts, right? Never a skirt or a dress because that's what's designated for women, such as makeup, long hair, and nail polish. And so I want you to think about and consider sharing with us in the chat, how did you learn about your own gender? I'm super curious. Who taught you how to dress and groom yourself? Was there anybody in your family or at school that you mimicked? So I'm going to scan the chat, really curious. What did you learn about men and women in your own sense of gender? Mom, yep. Yeah, what did mom teach you? I'm really curious, as specific as you can get. What did your mom tell you about your gender? Right? Now, our society has come a long way from some of these really rigid ideas about men and women, right? Like feminist movements have challenged misogynistic social norms, right? And humans have always bent and distorted these roles in many ways. But gender identity and expression have a long documented history of policing in this country. In the 1850s and the 1900s, there were a series of anti-cross-dressing laws. These were used to target queer and transgender people who were trailblazers in challenging the gender binary and traditional gender roles. Now, while these policies no longer exist, they still impact the public's perception of acceptable gender practices. We still see these norms enforced through things like dress codes at schools and at work, right? Often prescribing boys and girls different sets of instructions on how to dress, groom, and even sometimes how to conduct themselves. I'm looking at the chat, so I'm hearing folks, or I'm reading folks saying, kind of demands on like, you need to wear makeup, you need to shave, or you need to be skinny, right? There's certain ways our bodies are supposed to look. To be classy, you have to sit with your legs closed. Oh yes, I got that one a lot too. Let's see what else. Yeah, so, our parents are huge influencers, right? They shape our brains, they teach us about the world, and they give us these ideas about ourselves and other people. Now, something I want you to consider is that this binary framework is not the rule of humanity. It is just one tool of gender socialization, and really has the power to alienate everybody, trans or not. Humans have never fit perfectly into one box or another. If we had 20 women in a room, they each would have their own distinct understanding of womanhood. There would be cultural differences, age interpretations, unique language, maybe even spiritual connections to womanhood and lineage, right? So every woman in the room would be unique and autonomous. But the gender binary really fails to recognize multiplicity and degrees of difference. So it's really important for us to understand that we are all moving with this bias, a heavy bias about gender, and it's informed by this system. Next slide, please. All right, so I also want to emphasize this, okay? Sex assigned at birth will not always communicate gender identity. The dominant practice in our society is to assign a sex at birth, then assign a gender to go with it, right? Female equals girl, male equals boy. But this isn't true for everyone. And there are actually more sexes and more genders than what has been made readily available. So sex is a biological description. It designates what you're assigned at birth. Typically, it's assigned based on your external genitals. However, sex is defined by external and internal sex organs, chromosomes, and hormones. Scientifically, there are actually more than 100 different sexes, which is really amazing, right? And so I want to encourage everybody to lean into this with curiosity and remember, sex and gender are different from each other. They don't need to rely on one another. And there's an incredible variety of what our bodies are capable of. And the more space that we can make in ourselves to hold this, the better we can hold it for our clients, our friends, and our loved ones. Next slide, please. So let's jump into this, all right? Just to be clear, cisgender, the way I'm gonna define it today, it's a person whose sex and gender is the same as what they were assigned at birth. This is kind of the opposite as trans, right? A person whose sex and gender is different than what they were assigned at birth. So if you just learned that you were cisgender, welcome. Now, cis normativity is the assumption that everybody is cisgender. Now, I'm trans, and so I love to pretend that everybody is trans until they tell me otherwise. It's a really fun game for myself. But the dominant, practice in our society, right, is like we only recognize people as cisgender until they tell us otherwise. And cissexism is a form of sexism, okay? And it's the belief that only cisgender people are normal and right, and that transgender people are unnatural and dangerous, okay? And so this involves perceiving cisgender identities as superior to trans identities. And cissexism results in things like medical malpractice and violence against trans people. Healthcare professionals are still circulating bad information to trans patients. For example, when I started hormone replacement therapy, I was told that I would become sterile and I would have no chance of having my own children. I was also never given options to family plan or freeze my eggs. There is not research to support these claims, and there are many trans folks who spend decades on hormone replacement therapy and are able to conceive their own children. Other healthcare blind spots include, framing reproductive health as women's health, ignoring trans men that give birth, that have periods and need pap smears, right? Or failing to recognize all the reproductive health needs of trans women that could include prostate exams, right? Often services are gendered and make huge assumptions about what is in somebody's body, right? Informed by cis sexism. Now, trans individuals are at a heightened risk of sexual violence, majority perpetrated by cisgender men, and it occurs both in private and public spaces, and is typically after the result of coming out or being found out. Trans feminine individuals are particularly vulnerable at the intersections of transphobia and misogyny, okay? Which we can describe this as trans misogyny. It's the discrimination of trans people and the hatred and denigration of women. And so trans misogyny is expressed through cultural hate, individual and state violence, and discrimination targeted at trans women and gender nonconforming femmes. So did y'all remember the Trump administration, right? They launched a series of policies that targeted trans individuals, which included amending the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They have an equal access rule. But the Trump administration proposed an amendment which would have eliminated protections to ensure that trans people experiencing homelessness could access shelter. Their proposal would have allowed federally funded housing services to turn away individuals whose gender does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So shelters would have been authorized to turn away someone based on good faith belief of a client's biological sex. Now, shelters are already sites of violence for trans people. They are often gendered and exclusionary, and it's really common for trans folks to experience harassment and sexual violence in these congregate living situations. Now, despite evidence of trans people and trans women having a higher risk of sexual victimization, trans femme individuals continue to face stigma and discrimination when seeking support services within substance abuse, mental health treatment facilities, at rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, and all kinds of other healthcare settings. And this is because providers lack the necessary skills, knowledge, and trans-affirming attitudes needed when working with diverse trans populations, which again is often a result of cis sexism. Next slide, please. So let's take a breath. That was a lot of information. So I just want to thank you for exploring some gender with me. And what I want you to take away is that we are all moving with biases about gender. And the more awareness that we can grow of our bias towards the binary, the better we can wield it. When we get into the crevices of this work, we really can make connections between how gender norms contribute to all kinds of violence, from genital mutilation, gender policing, medical malpractice, to state-sanctioned violence. And many of us have learned, rigid norms about masculinity and femininity, right? Masculinity often promotes aggression and domination over care and community. And femininity is also often described as subordinate and demure, right? And this creates expectations in our communities about how we will interact and shapes how sexual violence and harassment show up. So let's think about the saying, boys will be boys, right? Often used to excuse violence, harassment, and assault from men. Oh, they couldn't help it. It's their nature as men, right? It's why we teach women in thousands of ways how to avoid being assaulted versus teaching boys and men about enthusiastic consent, boundary setting, and other skills around communication and consent. So I just want to check in with Ashley. I'm wondering if you have anything that you'd like to add.
Yeah, Tiana, gosh, first of all, thank you so much for just really painting this picture of how rape culture and heterosexism, cis-sexism, really impact one another. I guess I'd just add that, as you said, rigid gender role norms are not only super constraining and limiting to people's ability to express identity and ability to be our whole selves. But we also know that adherence to these norms makes it more likely that multiple forms of violence will happen. And so we know that rigid gender norms really perpetuate larger systems of power, larger, instances of inequality and harm, and that many of these norms reinforce that it's acceptable for some people to be dominant and violent while others should be subordinate. And I think you gave some really great examples of what that looks like. And I think, another thing that you touched on that I just want to uplift is that these norms really make it difficult for people to have empathy and see one another as fully human. And that's one way that adherence to these gender norms can lead to violence, right? It's easier to be violent towards something rather than someone. And so if we don't see people as human, that violence shows up. And I guess I will end with the fact that the good news is that norms can and do change all the time. And so expansive norms around gender can not only uplift and affirm LGBTQ individuals, but also prevent multiple forms of violence. And not just sexual violence, but also intimate partner violence, youth violence, bullying, and child abuse and neglect. So that's the good news. But Tiana, I'll pass it back to you. Do you have any other comments on that?
Thank you for bringing that together. I think the last thing I want to say about this slide is, queer and trans people are not the only people who get to be creative and autonomous with their identities. We all have the ability to be critical and intentional with how we understand our gender and how we choose to move in relationships. Next slide. And then I think this is yours,
Thanks.
Ashley.
Yeah, thanks again, Tiana. So I just wanted to point out that we actually have some research that illustrates what Tiana just walked us through. And this is an area that I think is really promising in being able to affect and impact change when it comes to both homophobia and sexual violence. And that's the youth, amongst youth, specifically, and that's the bullying to sexual violence pathway. And so there is some emerging research that shows that youth, and youth in this case is really being defined as middle school age. So youth in middle school who use homophobic name calling in their bullying behaviors are at a significantly higher risk for perpetrating sexual harassment or sexual violence in high school. So there's kind of this pathway from name calling and teasing into sexual harassment and sexual violence. And so again, knowing that means that, we can work together, both fields, really to look at how do we stop bullying in elementary school that would then lead to a decrease in sexual violence perpetration among high school students. And Marcella, thank you so much for sharing that link that shows what that research is. I think it's really interesting. And so I encourage y'all, if that's something that interests you, to take a look at that. I'm gonna pass it back to you and go to the next slide.
All right. So heteronormativity, okay? It's the assumption that everybody is straight and being straight is the only normal sexuality. Okay, and heterosexism really describes systems that favor heterosexuality and marginalize LGBTQ people. Okay, sexuality is one of these things that's been regulated by government, right? We had policies in the 1950s that banned homosexual people from working in government and the military, right? The Trump administration tried to ban trans people from the military. Policies like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? Or DOMA, which define marriage as only between one woman and one man, right? And again, these types of policies influence the public's perception of LGBT people, okay? And have even influenced tribal councils who have adopted similar policies that still to this day ban same-sex marriage in various regions of the US. Let's even think about like homosexuality was listed in the DSM as a disorder until the 1970s. And queer and trans people continue to be pathologized and described under a guise of disease. Now, heterosexism creates really specific biases about what sex is, right? We're taught that sex is penetrative sex with a penis and a vagina, and the purpose is procreation, okay? All the other stuff, oh, that's just fooling around. It's not to be taken serious, right? Or that queer sex isn't real sex. So, you know, heteronormative ideas about sex create a limited narrative about what counts as sexual violence, right? There's a hierarchy of acts, right? That's ordered by perceived seriousness, with vaginal and anal penetrative sexual assault being perceived as more serious than other acts, right? And so we really want to make ourselves aware of our biases around sex and our imaginations about sex, and recognize that there are many different ways for us to have sex. And so it's important for us to understand this in the context of sexual assault so that we don't ignore the experiences of queer people. Marcela, did you have anything you wanted to add to this section?
I wanted to actually share the next quote that we have on the next slide so I can add a bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I found this from an article that I'm going to drop in the chat. And it's coming from Ryan, who's a bisexual man who's working in the LGBTQ community and uses he, him pronouns. And he says, I think that there can be a lack of understanding about sexual violence, even thinking back to topics about sexual health and sexual education and consent and all of that in school and in society in general. It often comes from a very heteronormative perspective. If penetration has not been involved, but it's been unwanted sexual contact, they may not necessarily associate what they've experienced with sexual assault or rape. And so I appreciated this framing from Ryan because it really demonstrates what Tiana was hitting home in terms of what happens when heterosexism and cissexism gets mixed up with how we understand our bodies, our genders, our sexuality, how we have sex. And it also impacts how we think about sexual violence. And I think when we have a much more expansive understanding of what sexual violence looks like, people have a much easier way of naming the abuse that they've experienced, right? Instead of feeling like they exist outside of the current definition that exists in this heteronormative framework, people can name what have happened to them. And I think most of us know that when people can't name what has happened to them, they're less likely to reach out for support, they're less likely to report their abuse, and they're less likely to think that people are going to believe what happened to them really happened to them. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and we're going to present a little bit on data and then jump into, we're going to skip this slide, Shelby. Thank you, Shelby. Yeah, we're going to move through some data and then we're going to skip into a breakout session so we can connect with folks.
I think we might have skipped an extra slide.
We're skipping due to time.
We're skipping all the, okay, got it.
Oh, we're going through the impact through the data slide, Shelby. It's the slide before this one. There we go. Yeah, thank you, Shelby.
Okay. Yep. All right, there we go. So thanks, Shelby. So this data that we're looking at is from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, sometimes referred to as NISVIS. And it's an ongoing survey by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that collects national data. And it's pretty limiting in terms of identity, but what I do want to highlight from it is that it does show that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are experiencing higher rates of rape, physical violence, and or stalking by intimate partners across the lifespan. So that's the first thing. The other thing I want to highlight from this data is that the impact of intimate partner violence, whether that's rape, physical violence, and stalking, appears to be more significant in impact among bisexual women and lesbians. And what I mean by that is more than half of bisexual women and a third of lesbians who experienced one of these forms of violence, so rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, reported at least one negative impact. And a negative impact was defined as missing school or work, being fearful, being concerned for their safety, or experiencing PTSD symptoms. And this was compared to a quarter of heterosexual women reporting impact. So I think that there's a lot of things that I think we can take from that information, but certainly I think it impacts how we think about providing support, advocacy to lesbian and bisexual women when we look at this particular data. And I'll pass it over to you, Marcella.
Thanks, Ashley. And we'll go to the next slide, Shelby. Thank you. So I just want to preface this showing this data by saying that the freedom to live with dignity and without harassment or violence is something that we all deserve, but the numbers that we're showing here, really describe the opposite for trans folks. I think we can see here from the data from the US Transgender Survey conducted in 2015, that overall trans people are experiencing 47%, like they're overall, we're seeing that 47% of trans people are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Most trans survivors have experienced repeated sexual assault. In fact, only about 27% of folks reported being sexually assaulted only once. And more than 75% of trans survivors reported that they had experienced unwanted sexual touching by the age of 12. And among trans people of color, the numbers are even more stark, with 65% of Indigenous respondents experiencing sexual assault. And I think this is something that we see often being covered by folks that are involved with organizing around missing Indigenous women, but also thinking about how this affects trans folks. We also see that experiences varied across gender. And I just want to note that while the data is inclusive of folks that cross-dress, I want to be mindful that we're not conflating being trans with cross-dressing. They are two separate things here. Cross-dressing is more so about gender presentation, and being trans is more so about gender identity. And so we see here that transgender men and non-binary folks assigned female at birth are experiencing some of the highest rates of sexual assault, with 37% of trans women and 41% of non-binary folks assigned male at birth reporting that they've experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. And so in another portion of the survey, we also found that trans women of color in particular were more likely to be harassed by strangers on the street or in their community because of their gender identity and their gender expression. And so I'm sorry, Shelby, not done yet. And so this data clearly shows that people who are multiply marginalized are often more likely to experience sexual assault. In fact, 72% of respondents who have participated in sex work, 65% of those who have been unhoused, and 61% of people with disabilities report having been sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And so we know that many of the survivors who were part of this survey were, almost never reported their abuse. Only about 90% or 9% of folks did. And only about 47% of folks chose to disclose this with a family, a friend, or a loved one. So we know we have quite a bit of work to do here. But this is time that we want to take to connect with you all and step into our breakout session. If we could go to our next slide. So we can talk about how folks are seeing sexual violence impacting the communities that you work. What kind of barriers are you seeing for survivors who are reaching out for support, either from community members or service providers? And what kind of support do you all need to support survivors of sexual violence? So I am going to go ahead and create 5 different breakout sessions, and we'll see how this goes. Well, let's connect. I'll see you all soon. Let's see. Oh no. I don't know why I'm not being moved to a breakout session. Alrighty, thank you folks who are coming back. I appreciate you all sharing your experiences in the breakout session. I'm still waiting for folks to come back. Alrighty, so as folks are coming back, I'm curious to hear from folks from each session if there were any things that stood out, any patterns that you saw, any barriers that you all were seeing in being able to provide services to LGBTQI survivors. I know in our group, there's sort of this intersection too of folks being either undocumented or, you know, truly just being fearful of trusting in law enforcement and possibly feeling like that wasn't really the route that they were hoping to take. And yet some of the services that that we provide sometimes do require you know, participation in reporting to law enforcement, whether that's because you want to go to a shelter. And so I think our movement is really trying to step away from really a reliance on law enforcement, so that for folks that are not interested in participating in the criminal justice system, that they still have some way of holding folks accountable, some way of starting their healing process. And I think sometimes accountability is the first start for folks. And yet that's something that many survivors don't get to see in their lifetime. Other folks that wanted to share? I know we're sort of speeding right through this webinar, so feel free to drop in the chat or unmute yourselves to share what kind of things are coming up for you at your centers. What kind of support do you all feel like you need to either transform the culture of your agency or come up with new protocol or new programming or partnerships?
I can share a little bit if that's okay.
Sure.
So my name is Sabrina. I'm from Orange County, California, and I work for Waymakers. And my group had spoken, one thing that had come up across a couple different people was kind of, though we might have training and we might feel quite competent working with the LGBTQ population, there's oftentimes not a lot of trust with the community. And I know at my agency in particular, even though our staff may be well trained, there's certain barriers, like at our main office where a lot of our clients come and do counseling with their victim advocates. We don't have like a gender neutral bathroom, which I know has been a barrier and has also been an issue because we also obviously not so much right now because we're working from home, but we also do our 48-hour sexual assault training in that building. And so we've had participants for our training who have not had a bathroom that accommodates their gender identity. And so that's been a barrier as well. And I know too, there's also been ongoing conversations in regards to our volunteer opportunities accompanying survivors to the hospital during a forensic exam. Typically, those would be solely women that get dispatched into that role of supporting survivors during forensic exams. And so as volunteers, and particularly non-binary volunteers and other folks across different gender identities have expressed interest in that, there's been kind of an ongoing discussion amongst like management and stuff about trying to balance what is going to make the survivor most comfortable versus not trying to be exclusionary. And so I think that's kind of a difficult space that that I've at least observed in our organization, because I'm part of the prevention, but obviously hear a lot about what's going on with victim services. So yeah, so that's from us.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Sabrina. I think across the board, we're seeing challenges in sort of the infrastructure and how our buildings are designed, not just thinking about inclusivity of gender, but also disability justice, thinking about are our buildings ADA compliant? Are we being accessible to all folks? And so important to be thinking about those things. Other folks that want to share? Other issues that are coming up? If not, that's quite all right. We'll have more time to check in with folks, checking the chat to see if there's anything in there. All righty. All right, so let's go to the next slide, Shelby. Thank you for being our slide master. So I'm going to go ahead and step into some of the more action-oriented things that we want to be talking about. But before we do that, I'm going to pull up a couple poll questions for folks that are not necessarily part of our rape crisis centers, but maybe LGBT centers or outside of our rape crisis center member agencies. So if you could go to the next slide, Shelby, that'd be great. Thank you. So these are the questions I'm going to go ahead and pull up. This is not what I wanted. Let's see. Let's go to my second poll here. So a couple questions here. Are you aware of your local rape crisis center? If you aren't a rape crisis center, have you connected with your local rape crisis center before? Does your intake process include questions about previous or ongoing sexual abuse or harassment? And we ask this just to check in to see if that is something that you're asking. You know, are you providing referrals to your rape crisis center? And lastly, does your agency include a victim services department? So it looks like first two are, you know, a little bit higher. Folks are aware of your rape crisis centers. You have connected with your rape crisis centers. Some folks are still voting, yes. Let's give folks a couple seconds. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Great news, most people are aware of their local rape crisis center. If you're not sure, I will go ahead and show you how to find your local rape crisis center. Most folks have connected to their rape crisis center. Here we go, maybe I should be sharing the results. Yes, does your intake process include questions about previous or ongoing sexual abuse? Some folks are saying yes, some folks are unsure. And yes, of course, does your agency include a victim services department? Some folks are saying yes, some folks are saying no. All righty, thank you for sharing that. It's always good to know, you know, what people are doing, what people are aware of. All righty, so if you could go to the next slide, Shelby, so I can show folks where they can find their local rape crisis center. So I'll go ahead and drop this link in the chat. And this is a system where you can go ahead and search where your rape crisis center is just by entering your city or your zip code. Go ahead and check that out. And then I just wanted to give a quick breakdown for folks that are maybe not as acquainted with rape crisis centers. Traditionally, these are the services that are available. We often see all agencies have some sort of crisis response team where survivors can reach a trained professional, crisis intervention professional, either 24/7 or, I think some agencies do 9 to 5, so you'd have to check with your agency. I think something that we commonly see as well is accompaniment during medical and forensic exams. And this is often the exam that folks go through after they experience a sexual assault. We also offer one-on-one counseling, support groups, peer counseling, either for individual survivors or their loved ones included. And I think much of what I've talked about already includes advocacy, but I think advocacy is a piece that also includes learning how to navigate certain systems. I think it can be difficult to be navigating many different systems, whether that's trying to find a housing, filing a restraining order, maybe getting your ID marker changed so that it aligns with your gender and your name. And so this is really a big role that I think oftentimes advocates can play in terms of identifying agencies that are trauma informed and that are community centered. And last but not least, a huge shout out to folks that are doing prevention and providing community education. An important piece of our work is obviously responding to immediate needs, but it's also thinking about long-term, how can we prevent sexual violence from happening? And I think oftentimes, someone said this earlier in the chat, is that people think that violence is inevitable when in fact it is preventable. So I am going to pull up our next audience chat question. If we can go to the next slide. We're skipping a few slides here. Sorry, Shelby. If we'd go to the audience chat question. And just check in with folks. What is one thing that you've learned today that was new for you, that you can take back to your community or that you can take back to your center? Give folks a couple seconds to respond, and then we're going to switch over so that Tiana and Janae can talk about some of the partnerships that they've been able to build at their respective agencies. Just checking in to see. Sabrina, yes, the bullying sexual violence pathway in early adolescence. I think, and I wanted to say this earlier, but I think it's a good example of why prevention is so needed in public school systems. I think sometimes people can be a bit resistant to the idea of providing prevention education to younger folks, and so it's a good study to be sharing with administrators. Yes, Beth, there are many gender identities. Glad to be able to share that with folks and create a lot more of a gender expansive culture. New terminology, Sandy, yes. Thank you. Thank you to the folks that have shared. Awesome. Also the bully sexual violence pathway. New terminology. What was the new terminology that folks were learning today? Cissexism. Okay. Yeah. Alrighty, folks. I'm going to pass it over to our next section on demonstrating a culture shift. If we can go to our next slide. So I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to Tiana, who is the Director of Training and Communication, or Training and Community Education at the LGBT Center in San Diego. So I love that photo of you, Tiana.
Thank you. That's Samson, one of my dogs. So, all right. So our center, we work with our local rape crisis center, which is called Center for Community Solutions. We have an MOU with them that allows us to share counseling space in each other's facilities. And we participate in combined group supervision, which actually brings together both counseling teams from the center and from Center for Community Solutions, so that folks can co-learn, they can consult with each other, network, resource share, all that good stuff, right? So it's a really great opportunity for therapists, counselors, case managers to troubleshoot some of the issues that they're dealing with clients and really help fill the gaps in each other's knowledge. So that's been a really powerful space for our folks. What else? So, it also too, because like so our center, right, we have like a name and gender marker change clinic. We do that kind of advocacy. So it's really easy for any trans or queer folks that reach out to the Center for Community Solutions to be connected with our resources. So it's been super helpful in that sense. We also co-facilitate an all gender survivors group. And so it's the survivors that we support through the center have experienced intimate partner violence or sexual assault. And so this group actually meets weekly. It's very present focused. It's all about trauma recovery and skill sharing. The staff person that we have dedicated to this has a decolonial approach to therapy, offers tools of, semantic, meditation, CBT, mindfulness, all that good stuff, and leaving room for the group to really steer in terms of the needs that arise for group members. And that all gender survivors group is like amazing. I don't know any other groups that have degendered these kinds of spaces. Often they are like men and women's groups. So if you can create an all genders group, please do that, because we need more of those spaces. We are also a part of an LGBTQIA survivor task force, which includes representatives from the city attorney's office, County Board of Supervisors. We have other LGBT focused programs, grassroots organizations, and we invite community members from San Diego to join this task force. And really the goal of this group is to increase culturally competent services for victims and survivors of sexual violence and relationship violence that identify as LGBTQ. And so they really try to create spaces for survivors to connect with each other and find some resources. The strategies, for this group include advocacy at all levels, and also includes creating workshops that are really specific to providers, community members, and youth. We have a lot of youth workers on this task force. And then last, we screen all of our clients if they've been a victim of a crime, and we invite them to speak with us about it if they'd like. And then folks that are engaged with our behavioral health services are specifically screened for intimate partner violence. And we utilize a couple of assessment tools. One is called conflict tactic scales. And then there's another one we call the checklist of difficult life events. So we use these tools to screen all of our clients who enter our behavioral health services. So those are some of the ways that, we really try to partner and collaborate with our local rape crisis center so that we can serve our clients better and so that we can get connected to queer and trans clients who are accessing other services in the community. So thanks for the moment to talk.
Thank you so much, Tiana. Shelby, can we go to Janae's slide? It's the next one. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for giving me a few moments to speak and be a part of this. As we enter Pride Month and are reflecting on the leadership of Black trans women in this movement, I am just constantly reminded of how far we have to go as rape crisis centers in centering queer and anti-racist foundations in our movement. I think that we have come a long way, but we have a lot farther to go. My name is Janae. I use she, her pronouns, and I supervise the prevention education program at a dual center in San Luis Obispo, California, so right on the central coast of California. And I'm really excited to share just kind of the last couple of years of experience that I have in building what I think has become a really authentic partnership with our local Pride and Diversity Center. And I heard a lot of things that resonated with me on this call. I think specifically Sabrina was talking about the importance of trust, that we can have as much training as we want to, but you cannot authentically partner with LGBTQ centers and serve LGBTQ populations unless you have built that trust, because let's be honest, this movement has decades of toxic foundation that we are working to dismantle, and that doesn't just go away by putting up a rainbow or having an MOU, while those are powerful first steps. So, full disclosure, I feel really fortunate to lead the prevention department and be a queer identified woman and have a lot of these connections in my personal life as well. I started at RISE about 2.5 years ago as a community organizer and was involved with our Pride and Diversity Center leading the queer youth group. We also have other people at RISE who are involved in the Diversity Center, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I found a lot of the things that we heard here in that youth group and working with the senior group doing holiday parties, people saying that these are not conversations that they have, saying that they don't feel safe at rape crisis centers because oftentimes we're called women's centers, or because they know someone who had a terrible experience of being misgendered or experiencing discrimination, and knowing that that partnership had to come from the ground up. And so for us, it really started with asking the executive director of the Gala Pride and Diversity Center, which is our local LGBTQ center, to come to RISE and to chat with our Cultural Humility Action Team, which I was also a part of. And we had a really frank conversation with her about how we were not accessible and what we needed to do to get on the right page and start building trust. So she pointed out things like our intake forms were outdated because for us, having to meet grant requirements, we only offered male, female, and transgender. We didn't offer people the choice to identify themselves however they are, that we don't have policies and procedures that hold staff accountable for respecting pronouns and identities, that we don't have policies written into our shelters for if clients are discriminating against other clients. And so asking her for her feedback was the first really important step. The second, more important step was to take it to heart and to do something with it. I would like to say, for anyone who wants to do this work in an authentic way, if you're working at a rape crisis center or a domestic violence shelter, you will experience pushback. You just will. We like to think that we're the most progressive people out there, but we are not. I know that I experienced pushback at my agency, even though RISE, I would say, truly is incredible. But at the end of the day, if you experience a barrier, that is your chance to step up and show up for the LGBTQ community and for marginalized communities that we say that we serve. It's difficult, but it's worth it. And if we're not willing to put in that work, then we shouldn't be calling ourselves community serving agencies. So it was a 2-year uphill battle. We are not even close to where we need to be. I'm proud of where we are. We have a lot further to go. But upholding ourselves to those standards has allowed us to build a really authentic relationship with the Gala Pride and Diversity Center that has served us both. So we partner with them. During COVID, we offered queer youth movie nights where we delivered baggies to everyone all over the county. We offered a virtual prom night because we have funding in some places that they don't. Someone in my prevention staff serves on the Gala Pride and Diversity Center board. She's also on this call. Shout out to Arthi. She's incredible. We also have compensated the Gala Pride and Diversity Center to train our staff on how to effectively serve clients who are transgender, who are in the kink community, and who are in polyamorous relationships. So a lot of time we think about, once we respect pronouns, we're where we need to be, but that is just not true. Just like there are intricacies to all communities, there are intricacies to LGBTQ community, and that was an incredibly powerful training that we got from them. And in return, along with compensating people with lived experience for their work, we also provide their educational materials for their education department. So Arthi serves on their educational board through RISE and is able to use her time with RISE to create their materials that they go out into the community and give to people, talking about how the intersections of sexual assault and LGBTQ identities are in San Luis Obispo. All in all, again, I think we have a long way to go, but where we are now is that I have the executive director of the Pride and Diversity Center in my cell phone, and we lean on each other when we need to. It's not something that just exists in an MOU. Again, while they are really important, it doesn't just exist when we show up to Pride and say who we are. It's about us leaning into each other and knowing that you cannot obliterate one form of violence without fighting all forms of violence. We are talking about we were talking about oppression and institutionalized violence, and that takes a coalition of people. We can't operate in silos. So I'm really grateful for RISE for giving me the opportunity to do this work, and I'm really excited to see what you all do with it in the future. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Janae and Tiana. And I just want to uplift the work that you all have been doing and what your organizations have been able to accomplish. I think it can be really intimidating to hear where people are at after years and years of the work that you're doing. But I just want to uplift that there are so many different ways to build up to these levels of collaboration where, you could start by showing up to somebody's community health fair and tabling there, and then learning about what services you all provide, learning about, what can you take home to your organizations. Like you said, starting an MOU is really just the floor of the relationship. And, building that relationship takes time. It takes effort. And I think oftentimes we get excited, but something that I always like to remember is that we have to move at the speed of trust, right? We have to get to know each other. What is our mission? What are our values? What can each organization do for each other, and be able to not just be able to be reciprocal in our relationships, but really think about how we can transform our organizations and how we can use that transformation to transform our communities. We sort of had to fly by through a couple of the slides, but I just wanted to be able to uplift that and remind folks that building up to these partnerships takes years and years of trust building and education and community organizing. So I appreciate you all for doing that work. And I want to go ahead and step into questions for our audience to respond to. We're going to go ahead and do a breakout session, but I think we can stay in our large group and answer some of these questions together. If you could go back to the other slide, Shelby. Just curious to hear from folks, what are the histories of collaboration in your area? If you don't have any history of collaboration, what kind of concerns do you have for beginning a collaborative relationship? What examples of collaboration would you like to share with your organization? And I know I'm presenting these questions for the audience, but I also want to give folks an opportunity to ask our two presenters, Janae and Tiana, any questions about their partnership that may relate back to what it looks like to demonstrate really great partnerships. Thank you, Arti. Thanks for joining us. Thankful to have you here. Alrighty. And folks are welcome to unmute themselves to ask questions or to drop some questions in the chat. We appreciate you for staying with us for the last 9 minutes. Questions for our presenters. I know a couple folks were saying that they do provide support groups for all genders all together, and some folks were saying, I'm thinking about doing this myself. I'm thinking about presenting this to my leadership team. So I know that sometimes we show up to our webinars and we're like, these are all these great ideas. How do I present this to my leadership team? How do I get buy-in from the rest of the organization? So that's what we're here for. Thank you, Katie. So you're saying collaboration within our area is good. However, it can be challenging, especially from law enforcement side of things. Concerns I would have with new collaboration is if they don't meet our standards or assist our clients would be a huge concern. Katie, could you share a bit more about what kind of concerns you have in terms of law enforcement? Is it, there are an array of reasons we could have concerns with law enforcement. So I'm curious to hear what's showing up for you and your organization, Katie.
Yeah, so I am the trainer for our organization. So I go out, provide trainings, and I've been here for 3 years. So I've given at least 5 trainings to law enforcement, and it literally goes through one ear out the other, which is really frustrating because you really want them to understand the side of the victim and what they're going through. And I understand that they have their own way of looking at things. But specifically learning from our agency is challenging because they're still calling us, well, how do you work this situation? Or what would you do with this client? And so it makes me curious how many clients that they've actually had that they could have called us and, we could have assisted that they did not, did not call us out. So just challenges like that has been the focus of the past couple years in my line of work.
Yeah, I don't think you're alone in that. I hear often that advocates are sort of suspicious of whether they're receiving, if they're getting called by law enforcement, if law enforcement are kind of, dictating who, when and who to call about. And so, I think sometimes training only goes so far. And so what can we do as a movement to also think about alternatives to the criminal justice system? I know that these are not new ideas. We think about what restorative justice and transformative justice looks like in our communities. And by no means are these easy way out. Are they an easy way out of working with law enforcement? They still present challenges and difficulties as well, and are going to be a huge learning curve if they're things that we're thinking about implementing in our own organizations. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Katie. You are not alone in that, unfortunately. I'm reading Sabrina's comment. She says, I would say one barrier we have is that my program is a rape crisis center within a larger organization that works closely with the DA's office and conservative donors. Our organization does not publicly stand for anti-oppression work or uplifting marginalized communities, which is frustrating. Absolutely. Like I mentioned, you might show up to a webinar and feel that these are things that are resonating for you, that these are things that you want to bring back to your organization. So Sabrina, let's check in. I'll drop my email in the chat so that we can check in and think about, what does it look like for us to start to advocate with our leadership team, with our board members, to really be not just thinking about sexual violence in a silo as a single issue struggle, but as a form of violence that's uplifted by systems of oppression. That's something that we can't do that without that. We can't do this work without acknowledging that. Thank you for uplifting that, Sabrina.
That's a struggle that we also have, and I would imagine most rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters do, whether you are embedded with the DA's office or not. I would say what's been helpful for me has been bringing it back to our mission, vision, and values, which I know sounds like such hoity-toity ED talk, but that's why sometimes it works. And starting at intersectionality, which feels like it's so 101, but my leadership has started allowing me to do monthly workshops on intersectionality for the community, inviting our board members, inviting the DA's office. Do they always show up? No. Are they recorded so that I can bring them back to my agency and say, this is why we need to be doing anti-racism work? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Janae. Sometimes we use language that we normally wouldn't use with our community members that we often have to shape shift and utilize with our board members. All righty. Thank you so much, folks that have been sharing so far, and folks that have been sitting with this information and processing and thinking about how to bring this back to your agencies. We have about 3 minutes left on the webinar, just checking in to see if folks have any last minute questions. Shelby, if you could go to our resources page so I can share that with folks, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So certainly use our website as a resource. I know that Ashley's been dropping some links in the chat as well. Haven't been able to see what that is, but yes, absolutely. Prevention Institute is a great resource. We have a couple different resources that we utilize with them. Mirror Memoirs is another project that was uplifted and founded by a queer survivor, a non-binary survivor, that uplifts stories of sexual violence for survivors that identify as queer or trans or non-binary. Of course, we have Prevent Connect, we have Forge and the Trevor Project, and of course, in the fall of this year, we'll be coming out with our community blueprint for folks to take a look at and provide guidance in terms of building your partnerships. And thank you, Janae, for dropping your email in there. I think we can say that many of us on the call that have been on this webinar are happy to connect with you if you have further questions. And I think that this is just the start. This is just the beginning and a continuation of a history of these collaborations. And so any way that we can continue supporting beyond this webinar, please feel free to reach out to us. And I'm going to go ahead and drop our survey in the chat as well. Thank you, Tiana, for dropping your email so that folks can give us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. What was helpful? What did you expect to learn? What would you like to learn? Still searching for that survey. There we go. So we encourage folks to provide feedback. It really is helpful when we're building these webinars. There's
Marcella, can I make a plug for our next session in this series?
Yes, definitely. Go for it.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, this is really a web conference series for community partners over the summer. At the end of summer and going into fall, we'll be kind of focusing the series specifically for our rape crisis centers. But next week, our next session, I'm going to put the registration link in the chat, is a web conference looking at partnering with disability service providers, specifically service providers working with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So if that is a partnership that you are engaged in or you would like to be, we invite you. If you have partners that are part of the disability service providers community or disability community in general, please share this link and we'd love to have you in that session as well.
Thank you, Ashley. So I think that concludes the rest of our webinar. We are so thankful that you joined us and we hope you reach out to us. We dropped some of our emails in the chat. And we hope you reach out and find us and we can hear how things are going, what kind of institutional changes have happened. We'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.